Thank you very much, Liz. So in the morning we had a discussion on the SDGs, 17 of them, 169 targets, cutting across a whole range of aspects of development, which is a mix of social sectors and something on the wider environment in which, in which we work. The big difference, of course, is in the politics around the setting of the goals. It's much more political, as we see. It's much more holistic. It's much more connecting between the North and the South, the developed world and the developing world. And that's what makes it very, very different from the MDGs. But to me, the differentiating factor also has been the extensive process of consultation that happened in the run-up to the in the run-up to the finalization of the SDGs. There was a 2 to 3 year period of consultation that went across the board. That's what made it quite fascinating.
And just sort of on that, what's for you are sort of the standout goals, or is there a particular goal that you think is the linchpin? Like if we get that one, everything else will fall into place.
Well, it's goal 5, and I think in ActionAid we have taken a look at all the goals. Goal 5 is on gender equality, and one of the huge challenges in the MDG era was that we really couldn't achieve much when it came to the rights of women and girls. And here we have massive potential of making sure that all the governments and civil society and the general public can come together to ensure that women and girls have access to services, improved livelihood opportunities, to enable them to participate fully in the social, economic and the political environment of the country.
And Phil, I'm going to pass that question on to you as well. What do you think is the standout goal, or what do you think was the one that you are particularly pleased and made it in there?
Well, I have to say, and I would say anyway, the peace, justice, security and institutions, which is also one of the biggest differences between the two. Can't really imagine a way of thinking about human progress without those public goods being in it.
With Goal 16, I know when there was, throughout all the very long, detailed negotiations, this was the one that was very particularly controversial because it's so political. There was key countries that really pushed back on it, and then now we're looking at the indicators to how we're going to measure these sorts of things. Was there anything that was missing that you'd have liked to have seen in that particular, in the targets of that goal, or is there anything you're concerned about that's still being discussed about the indicators, because it is a highly political goal?
I must admit, I'm not that familiar with where they are with the indicators for that goal yet. That's partly because I'm not all that interested in the indicators. I think it's the vision, it's having that kind of sun shining on the opposite hill, which says we can aspire to have more peace, better institutions, more accountable institutions, be safer, etc., etc., etc. And I would want to encourage everybody to figure out their own indicators for that in their own context. I think what's missing, however, is that anybody can still read Goal 16 and not notice that it's about politics. The word institution is one of those brilliant words which is so powerful. I mean, the word institution in an anthropologist's notebook is a really powerful idea. The word institution in a political scientist's notebook is a little less interesting, and the word institution, frankly, in the media is boring, and it's sort of it's the former version of the word institution, which is so interesting, but I think it will be missed by most users, if I can say that, of the SDGs. So it's really important to keep redefining. I think what we have to do is each redefine what we mean by these words when we use them. Because as I was saying before you weren't here, everyone's got to use the SDGs for their purposes. Some of us will be right and some will be wrong, and that's politics and that's humanity and progress.
I do like that expression, sun shining on the opposite hill, and that's a really good way of thinking about it and the vision. And just, Girish, you've obviously said that for you it's Goal 5. Obviously gender equality, again, political in a whole other load of different way. Were you happy with how that goal ended up and the targets, or are there things that are missing for you, generally across the goals when it comes to gender equality issues?
I think in the way it's been framed in an equality language and through a gender lens, it does provide us with a massive hook to actually work on. The potential is absolutely immense. And in the morning, I was referring to one of the targets on elimination of all forms of violence against women and girls in public and private spheres. So nothing could be potentially stronger, nothing could be potentially more political, nothing could be more transformational across countries. And mind you, this is not just about developing countries. We have issues of violence against women and girls even in this country, and we've had severe issues we all know about it. It's been there in the media. I suppose the point is in terms of how would that be translated in the context of the different countries that we are in, because the manifestation of that violence or the drivers of that violence could be very, very diverse, and that's where the devil would be in the detail, because there could be and there will be situations where violence against women is actually justified on the grounds of culture, on the grounds of religion, on the grounds of patriarchal values. That's what is valued in that particular culture, and that's something we need to be very, very careful of. That it's not just a type of domestic violence. For example, rape is a very extreme form of violence, but it talks about all kinds of violence against women in public and private spheres. So it also it makes it very personal, and it takes you home. So the devil is in the detail of actually defining what that means and how transformative we can bring it out to be.
Now, I think it was a couple of years ago, or at least a year before the goals were finally signed, David Cameron said, 17 goals, too many, I prefer to have about 10 or 12. Rachel, is that such a bad thing? Do we expect governments to cherry pick, and is that okay as long as they do something?
So I have to say my initial reaction when they came out was, oh boy, we've put absolutely everything that we want here, and therefore, if the objective was about prioritising, maybe that wasn't the objective, but if that was the objective, we certainly haven't achieved it. But I think, I have a very particular perspective. A lot of my work is in the poorest countries. So I'm working in Sierra Leone and Burkina Faso, also Pakistan and Bangladesh, but those two are kind of very dear to my heart, and they really are the bottom, rung on so many different indicators. And for them, it's just completely hopeless. There's no way that they can move on all of those things. They really have to prioritise. And so, I'm not against the idea that we've developed goals so that other people can, because if you just did goals that are relevant to Sierra Leone, then a lot of countries have already reached those, and that's fine. But certainly if you think about somewhere like Burkina Faso, they still haven't even achieved universal access to education. And the biggest health challenges there are still, malaria and so if you try to put on, their agenda these huge number of things, then they will have to prioritise within them. I don't think there's any way around that.
And is that such a bad thing, do you think?
I guess it depends on what you think the objective of these goals were. I think that one of the things that the Millennium Development Goals did very well is pick a few things and then hold people account to them and measure them. And so we actually knew, how many kids were in school, how many girls were in school. But then you get the problem that then they were sort of mainly relevant to a few countries. Most of the change was happening in a few countries, and you weren't tackling, smoking and obesity and things like that, which were very relevant to other countries. So if you're fine with saying everybody, pick one, or pick a few within health or within education, but that you slightly lose the momentum of everybody, everybody focusing absolute laser-like attention on getting kids in school. So I guess it's a trade-off. It's a trade-off between having focused attention and having something that's relevant to everyone. And I don't really have a very strong opinion about exactly where we ended up, as long as we're realistic in saying, and this is where the indicators comes in, there is, not only can Sierra Leone not reach all of those goals in all of those areas, they can't even measure them all. Because if we could measure learning in Sierra Leone, just, how many kids could read, that would be a huge benefit. But they can't, it's just not really. I mean, we could do it, but they'd have to give up an awful lot of other things like improving education. If they tried to, if we put too much effort into monitoring all these things, we won't have any money left to actually do them.
Phil, just come to you and ask the same question really. I mean, are you concerned that governments will cherry pick? Does it really make a difference?
Am I concerned governments would cherry pick? Yes. What I'd like to think is that will lead some activists in their countries to say, why are you picking that cherry? And create a political debate and a policy debate. And I think if you go to Sierra Leone, one of the difficulties of Sierra Leoneans is to sort of move politics towards policy. And in a way, what is politics? It's about prioritising scarce resources, ultimately. It's a system of managing societal decisions in order to say what is more important we think today, and therefore what do we invest our money and other resources in today. And that is fundamental that those decisions get made by the societies themselves. And I actually think one of the problems with the MDGs was the sort of perverse incentive of saying it's about primary education. I think and I've had this conversation with people in a lot of countries, there's a very valid debate to be had about whether a country should go straight from an elitist education system straight to universal primary education with the poor quality of results. Now, one can have different views on that, but it may well be that people are not wrong who think taking an incremental approach to that change, that those people are right, or they certainly deserve to have their voice heard, I think. So I think governments will always cherry pick if they're allowed to by their stakeholders. Who are their stakeholders? The people they're governing. So this is a tapestry for discussion, difficult issues.
Thank you. So Girish, I'd like to ask you about the indicators which we've talked about, and I haven't got a clue where we're at with the indicators. I did know, and now it's all changed again, and I'm hearing so many things about not having them sorted until next year, or all these sorts of things. Girish, how important is it that we get some decent indicators so we can actually measure this? Given what Rachel said about putting too much burden, and if the cost of all that, what's important for you when it comes to indicators?
That's a difficult. That's a difficult. Well, there are certain areas where indicators are absolutely important, and we can get a very clear view of the progress. And I think Rachel's presentation really highlighted some of the key areas around provision of health services or education services, and see, where are we? I used to work in the water and sanitation sector, and again, there were certain areas where you could say that the indicators can be really you can fix indicators, but one of the biggest challenges in the water and sanitation sector was on sustainability. What are the indicators of sustainability? I mean, we can talk about what's happening, or the number of schools that have got access to water and sanitation, but how sustainable are they, and what are the real indicators of sustainability? I was in the water and sanitation discussion in the other room, and there was a lot of discussion on institutions and on governance. How do you really measure governance? How do you measure the prioritization that Phil was just mentioning? Because at the end of the day, we have to also move this debate to it being about power and politics, because every country has got a bunch of ruling elites, and that needs to be challenged, because unless you challenge the existing power structures, you're not going to do enough to address the most fundamental causes of poverty, injustice, and inequality. And that's where I think the SDGs and the indicators around that provide a good starting point, but I wouldn't say that that's the be-all and end-all of the discussion. We have to get into those discussions on institutions, politics, who sets the priorities, and who wields the power.
Thank you very much.